Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Energy Day. And it's wonderful to see so many people gathering together, maybe at a little space, but thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to see you all. And not only in person, but we have people joining us online as well. My name is Robin Morris. I'm the convener for the Oxford Energy Network. And one of my roles is to make sure that people within the university working in the energy sector get to speak to each other, to learn about what each is doing and to help inform their activities. And I think for me, what would be a success today is to have some fresh insights, to meet new people and have ideas for how to collaborate and help us on today's topic, which is about energy and net zero in the UK. Now, if we look at the energy wheel shown on the poster here, then it's clear that a lot of the research here covers global issues. But to be fair, that is too much to chew off in one day's conference. And this year, the topic is about the UK. And if we're being particularly pernickety, actually, we're talking about Britain when it comes to the electricity system, for example. But we have a real challenge. And really, the challenge is not one of technology, and it's not one of willingness. It's one about the whole system, which includes people, what we do, and how we might change what we do. If we think of the tumultuous events in Ukraine affecting everybody's perception of energy crisis, the fact that suddenly we're talking about maybe we should be making better use of a precious resource and how can we reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But we already know that supply chains disrupted through the COVID pandemic and so on, there are things that we will want to leave behind. There's no point reconstructing the world that we had. What we want to do is to say, what are the co-benefits and what can we get from a net zero world that brings benefits for health, addressing fuel poverty, welfare, justice. So those are big issues. And if you're working on an energy storage technology, you may not directly touch on some of those issues, but you're here with researchers who are touching issues where people are involved. It's our behavior that actually drives almost all energy use. So again, being fair about today, the focus is actually about buildings, about transport, both of which use significant amounts of power, about where that power comes from and how that is distributed around the country and how we manage the balancing between when we need the energy and when it's being delivered. So I think by parallel streams, that allows us to break down each of those subject areas and have a detailed discussion. And today, in the Energy Day, we've taken a departure where not only do we have parallel sessions, and I know many of you feel a little bit torn as to which one you're going to, so we'll try to keep to the schedule so you can swap between. But the other element of it is the debate and the discussion. So we're allowing plenty of time to hear what the presenter is explaining, but then allow us to tease out, well, what does that mean for me? What does that mean in my work area? So just to explain this morning's agenda, really I'm filling the space of explaining the purpose and why we're here. But Mike Thompson from the Climate Change Committee is going to do the job of setting the scene for what the challenge looks like, the trajectories, and how we can enable and accelerate that. And then we're going to turn that to a local view to say, well, that's fine, but nationally we try to deliver, but there has to be a local dimension to what we do. It reflects the local people, the local landscape. So we'll hear from Pete Sudbury, who leads on that for the Oxfordshire County Council. And then how do we start to pull out the individual research programs in Oxford? There are so many. So we're picking on the highlights of some of the main programs, and we're delighted to have a number of speakers to guide us through what's happening in each of those areas. And what we're hoping to do is to do that in time to then take a tea break so that you can do more of the interaction mingling before we move over to the parallel sessions later on. So that is really all I wanted to say to start with. And I would have great delight in inviting Mike Thompson to come up and speak to us about UK's carbon budget and its trajectory towards net zero. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Not just because the sun is shining and I've been in isolation with COVID for most of the last week and a half, but because Oxford has been a brilliant collaborator with the Climate Committee actually for lots of years. We really value the research that you do here. We use it quite a lot. We value the researchers here as well. We do a lot of collaboration with lots of the academics here. And I think probably about a quarter of our staff, I think, have been through the Oxford system at some point or another. I'm also a local boy. I live just up the river at Charlbury, so it's lovely to come and talk to you here in Oxford. I've got some slides. I don't know if we can get them up somewhere. Someone's got a magic button. Something's happening. Cool. I mean, I just, as they're coming up, I just say I'm probably not going to tell people in this room that many new things that you don't know, but I guess my job here really is to set the scene for the day with the UK's plans. I've termed this kind of the subtitle "Beyond Blah Blah Blah," because I think this is a global problem and we have to see it in a global context, and that is the global context at the moment. The UK has been a climate leader. We were the first in the G20 to set a net zero target. That is now the standard around the world. It covers around 90% of global emissions, one way or another. But a lot of it is blah, blah, blah at the moment. You know, a lot of it is not backed by strong interim targets. It's not backed by strong plans to meet those, by policies to deliver them. It's not backed by action and delivery. So walking the talk on climate now is about doing that. It's about actually getting on with it, delivering it, implementing what we've said we're going to do. So I'm glad that I'm talking to you about plans that are getting more and more specific, more and more detailed, but where there's still a huge amount of work to do. So there's definitely a lot of space for the research community to help us to work out, well, how do we do it well? How do we do it better? Right. So this is going to be in two parts. So I'll talk kind of first of all about what needs to happen, and then get into, well, how are we going to achieve it? And those two are going to, they'll probably bleed into each other a bit, actually. And I'm going to do it based on two kind of main reports. The first is one from the Climate Committee ourselves, and hopefully you're familiar with this, our report on the sixth carbon budget, which was the path to net zero, laid out in kind of 1,000 pages of painstaking detail as to how we could get to net zero, what it would cost, what it would need to get there. And then the government's response to it that came last year, just before COP26 in Glasgow, the net zero strategy, which is the government's setting out, well, this is our plan, this is how we think we're going to do it. And I'll try and kind of overlay those two onto each other as we get through. So starting with that CCC path, and we tried to come up with a pathway that was neither slow nor fast, that wasn't rushed, but wasn't kind of slow and steady. We wanted it to be decisive. We wanted it to be definite, that said, right, this is the pathway that we're on. Let's do it as quick as we possibly can within the realms and the constraints of what we know is actually feasible. And this is the pathway that we came up with, drawing itself on the screen here. And so this is UK emissions, I should say. You've got kind of the black line is the historical emissions, and then the dotted purple line there, that's the pathway that we've said this is what the UK has got to do now. This is where we need to head. That's our fair contribution to what the world needs from the UK as a domestic target, as a domestic contribution. And Climate Action Tracker have rated this as the only domestic set of targets in the world that are 1.5 consistent. So this is kind of outside of the UK verified as something which is a pretty sensible path. Don't say that it will never change across this future, but at the moment, this is a good set of targets for the UK to have. And you can see that dotted purple line there. It has a kind of inverted S shape. It takes a little while to get going as we scale up the new markets for heat pumps, for electric cars, within industry, climate, carbon capture and storage, etc. And then it goes at its full speed down through the 2030s once everything has got going. And then as we start to kind of get some of the areas down to zero, well, then it slows down a bit and glides into 2050. And just picked out on here the two call outs. This is the basis for the UK's NDC, our submission to the UN process, and the basis for that sixth carbon budget 2035 target of a 78% reduction on 1990. So that's kind of what the targets are. And now let's get into, well, how can we deliver them? What does it take to do them? And we've split it into 4 rough areas. You can split this so many different ways. This is how it's split on here. I'm starting up at the top. The 2 purple stripes on this rainbow are about the demand side. So those are things that people can do without necessarily changing any technology. So things we can do with making things more efficient, but fundamentally the same set of technologies. And they can only do so much in the long run. Maybe they can do a bit more than this. Maybe in reality they'll do a bit less. But in the short term, these are so important, right? If you want to get your energy bills down now, it's going to take you a while to get your insulation sorted and to get your heat pump in, but you can turn down the flow temperature on your boiler. You could turn down your thermostat if it's at a high level above 18, say. If you want to save some money, you could eat a bit less meat. You could reduce your food waste. And all of those things will also cut your carbon. They're things that we can do quickly. But the big action through to 2050, we think, is through a substitution and a move to low carbon, zero carbon technologies. Most of that is electrification, electric heat pumps, electric cars, even potentially electric trucks, electric buses, and electrification in industry. Supplemented with a bit of hydrogen, with a bit of carbon capture and storage, where electrification won't really work. And of course, to do that, you also need to have a big supply of zero carbon electricity. That's the blue chunk on here, about supplying those zero carbon energy vectors. But all of that doesn't still get you quite to zero, because actually there's things like agriculture, where the fundamental process is there. We don't have substitutes for that don't involve release of nitrous oxide or methane. So we have to also have some offsetting of emissions at the end. That's the green chunk on here. That's growing more trees to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, potentially using those trees with carbon capture and storage, or other biomass vectors with carbon capture and storage to get negative emissions. All of that together gets you down to net zero. And I wanted to just show this. This is kind of drawing the individual paths for each individual sector, just to kind of capture that. We didn't just kind of draw that nice purple line because it felt like the right shape. It does feel like the right shape, but it's the result of all the kind of detailed analysis of individual sectors that we've done to get to this. And this is just showing, you can pick out a couple on here, maybe electricity supply, the yellow one. It kind of rattles along reasonably flat, actually, in the next 5-10 years, because the nuclear is coming off and needs to be replaced. Then it drops fairly quickly, and it's getting down to zero pretty close to 2035, actually. And you can contrast that with, say, buildings, the orange one, which really takes a while to get going, because the low carbon options there, the heat pumps, are at such an early stage. Hydrogen is an alternative, again, early stage. It will take a while to get those going. And then, of course, it catches up and it does get down to zero just before 2050. Lots of different possibilities for all of these sectors, of course. These are not definitive paths. These are the kind of what we think is a relatively sensible balance of effort would lead to something like this. But it's different in the different sectors. And policy, of course, needs to respond to that. Policy needs to provide different solutions for the different circumstances that we're facing. Just a couple of slides, just on the kind of key observation really behind all of these, which is that the least disruptive path is one with less capital scrappage. And so you can look at some fairly simple things, like a boiler typically stays in homes for 14 years on average. A car stays on the road for 15 years on average. I've got those the wrong way around. But you can look at those things. And so that tells you that, look, by 2035, you better make sure that these things are zero carbon, and that all of the new ones going in are zero carbon. And so that kind of fundamentally defines a lot of this path for us, actually. And that then is reflected in phase out dates that we've built into those pathways that I've shown you. So those pathways are developed in a slightly policy real way. So they are imagining that we have policies that mean that from 2032, all new cars are non-fossil fuel. They're electric primarily. All boilers are no longer using gas. All the boilers going in are either hydrogen at that point, or more likely heat pumps, or maybe on a district heating network. So that is kind of a fundamental thing in the analysis. And that, in a sense, is it's kind of the secret of the 2050 net zero target, is that really it's a 2035 target, because that's the point when everything has got to be zero carbon that's going in. Okay, so that was the CCC pathway. Let's then kind of overlay the net zero strategy on that, the government pathway. and the CCC one that I showed you before, that's now a solid purple line, but still purple at least. And the government is orange on here. Now the government's got a bit of a range because they like to hedge their bets a bit. And there is, of course, a much wider range of uncertainty around this, but you can see they roughly overlay. That's not a coincidence. They have to overlay because the legal targets that we've got in the UK are matched to the purple line. So the government strategy for delivering those targets has to roughly match in terms of emissions. But let's go down to the next level. And if we split it at a sector level, so kind of the dotted little purple dots on here, these are the CCC ones from that kind of spaghetti chart I showed you a minute ago. We've overlaid the government ranges for each sector against those. And again, this is pretty similar actually to what we've come up with. Differences in buildings, which actually reflects that between our report being out and the government's, different assumptions have gone in about the impact of COVID, the lasting impact on people's behavior in terms of how they heat their homes, but also in terms of the kind of the underlying climate that the UK is facing. This, I think, has actually got a slightly more realistic expectation for future climate and therefore future UK heating needs. So some of this actually is in the baseline being different rather than different actions to get there. And then they've taken that slack and they've used it in the aviation sector and in the North Sea. But otherwise, this is pretty similar to the UK one. Let's drill down one more level. And when you look at the kind of headline, the anchor outcomes in each sector, again, they're really, really similar to the UK, to the Climate Change Committee ones that we put forward. So a fully decarbonised power system in 2035, a scaled up low carbon hydrogen supply by 2030, phase out of new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030, or a bit of leeway in the governments for hybrids, but pretty similar to the CCC 2032. EPCC everywhere by 2035. Heat pump installations are a bit lower in 2028, but actually they catch up in the government trajectory. So by 2035, cumulative, you end up with about the same amount. Similar on CCS, similar on tree planting. And you can kind of go through most of the big areas, and those are similar. Big differences on the demand side. Government has very much chosen a route which does not require people to do anything different and doesn't even encourage people to do anything different, actually. That's a political choice that they've made. You can still make the numbers add up with it, and they've shown how you add those up. We don't think that's a good idea still. We think these are things that are sensible to pursue. These are things that are desirable for lots of reasons, like better health for lower carbon diets, and they're relatively low hanging fruit that it makes sense to pursue. And I think we will probably see that some of this happens, and we will see some kind of policies, I think, as well, that sort of encourage it a bit, but without central government buy-ins. There's been an interesting kind of dichotomy there. So that's kind of roughly the plan, and as I say, it stacks up and it's aligned to what the targets require. And I just want to say actually two things on why these are so similar. One is that, as my chairman would say, there's not that much elbow room in the trajectory. There's not that many things that you can do differently. You know, you can sort of push the kind of dials up in one area and down a bit in another area, but fundamentally it's such a stretching target, you kind of have to do everything. And it's only because there's been a bit of extra hot air, if you like, that's come in from the pandemic and from those different baseline assumptions has allowed them to dial things down a bit on the demand side. Otherwise, there's not that much slack. And the other, I think, is just a political economy observation, and great to see that kind of at the top of the dial here, because I think it's so fundamental to climate action. And the political economy of kind of having an independent body like the Climate Committee, and how that then feeds through to not just kind of cross-party positions, but actually to getting through arguments within government, arguments between departments. It's a really quite a powerful thing, actually, because it allows BEIs who are going out and trying to persuade the FT, say, to make their contribution to this, to draw a line and say, well, look, this is the baseline, right? The baseline is no longer that you do nothing. Starting point for this conversation is that our independent advisor has said, this is what you should do. And so you shift the political economy a bit, and that is a pretty important thing to do in the climate problem, which is all about political economy, really. Okay, good. Going on then to part two, and the subtitle for this one is Scale Up and Roll Out, because that is fundamentally what we're trying to do in most of these areas. Scale up those supply chains, scale up those markets, and then roll them out from 2035. So I'll skip over that one, actually. And then that's kind of two observations I want to make on it. The first is that this is, to some extent an investment problem. This is about getting the money to flow into the low carbon solutions. And this is trying to give you a sense of the scale of that. So this is billions of pounds a year. We've currently been spending about 10 billion on the extra cost of low carbon measures. And we'll need to get that up to something like 50 billion by the end of this decade. And you can see that split, the big sectors here. Transport, we expect these cars for a while to be more expensive than the ones they're replacing. Charging network, obviously, alongside that as well. Buildings, heat pumps, energy efficiency, these are more capital intensive. These are more expensive up front. So there's an investment cost attached to those. And of course, the renewables, potentially the nuclear, alongside to power all of that, much more expensive up front, much cheaper to run once you get it there. And then a bit as well across networks, across the agriculture sector and the industry sectors. So the challenge is to get, this is going to be largely private money, I should say. And so the challenge is to get that private money flowing and getting into all of these low carbon solutions. And the good news is, of course, that that comes with a huge payoff as well. Make those investments and you get a massive saving in operating costs. And by the kind of end of this horizon, we're looking at those operating costs will be larger than those capital costs that we're incurring. And of course, in a world of high gas, high oil prices, this is 2020 analysis, sorry. In the world we face now with high fossil fuel prices, the top bit doesn't get much more expensive, the bottom bit becomes a much larger saving. So this picture, if you redraw it now, would look even more positive. The second one is that this isn't just an investment problem, of course, it's also a people problem. Because for the majority of the solutions we've got in here, you need people to make different choices. You've got the kind of bluey, purpley bit over here. That's the kind of drop in, that's renewables replacing gas-fired power stations. You flick the switch, you still have the same experience as the consumer. Although, discussions around onshore wind in the news at the minute. There's clearly still some consumer choices involved even in that bit. But the kind of majority then, the pink and the orange on here, these are things where people need to be choosing an electric car, say, they need to be choosing a heat pump, they need to be choosing energy efficiency for their homes. And then even in the 16%, these are kind of more purely behavioral, different diets, different travel choices, etc. So this needs people to make these choices properly, so or in a low carbon way. So that implies, well, policy needs to support them and encourage them to do that. Okay, then this slide then is kind of the CCC assessment of the government's plans that it's put forward across these 5 largest sectors in terms of emissions. And if you see at the top level, in most of these areas, we have got a plan published, great. The ambition in that plan aligns to the targets, great. And then as you go down and you get into kind of more and more detailed questions around it, well, we haven't actually got all the detail that we need, of course. In a sense, that's understandable. That's kind of where we are in the cycle. You have to have the strategies, you have to have the ambition, and then the policy to an extent then follows. But that's kind of where the action is now. It's in getting that implementation, getting that detail right. We've got roughly the right plans, and now we need to deliver it. And if I just rattle across the kind of the 4 energy ones here, the rough vision in transport is a mandate on manufacturers that they have to provide an increasing share of zero emission vehicles. In buildings, similarly, actually, an obligation on boiler manufacturers to supply an increasing proportion of heat pumps. Much less detail on how we'll do energy efficiency, also on heat networks, much less detail really there about how we'll get that to work in practice. So that's why you see a lot more kind of orange risks attached to the buildings plans at the moment. Industry is a kind of combination of grants, business models that have been provided and proposed for carbon capture and hydrogen, and of course the emissions trading system as the kind of overarching incentive there. And then the power sector, the vision here is that the contracts for difference that will be auctioned will provide the kind of bulk of the incentive to get the low carbon generation built. And the big question really on the power sector is about how kind of the rest of it works. So how you manage the system alongside that, how you get hydrogen in to provide the backup, to provide the kind of fill the gap when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, how you get more flexibility through the system, how you make sure everything is connected on a timely basis. Making the system work is the big gap that needs to be tackled in the future. And I won't get into agriculture because this is an energy conference, but suffice to say that's probably the worst of the lot at the moment, without really a plan at all to go alongside it. Right, and then I just want to make one final point, which is that kind of sectoral view misses lots of stuff. So it's useful, and it's kind of the primary thing that we do in CCC. We take that lens, but there's lots of things that cut across the economy and cut across those sectors that we need to get right, or we won't be able to deliver actually across any of those areas. And I've sort of listed a few on here. Skills is an obvious one, particularly when we think about the building stock. We think we need kind of 200, 300,000 more trained, skilled people across the supply chain there. Some of them installers, some of them retrofit coordinators, different roles, but there's kind of a huge scale up that needs to happen, as well as actually making sure that those people already in the industry have the skills to put in place good installations when they do stuff. Public attitudes and engagement, this is one the government is really ducking. They've kind of written some nice words in their net zero strategy about it, but in reality, really are doing very little on this at the moment. And again, with 60% of the action having to involve people making different choices, this stands out as a big gap that really does need to be resolved. Business engagement as well, because we need that investment, we need that money to flow, and business can be a big enabler of lots of this stuff. So again, kind of working out how to engage with business beyond just saying, here's a policy, give us your views by consultation, but actually enabling them in a bit more proactive way is the gap. Governance and coordination kind of covers a huge range of sins on here. This is within central government. This is from central government through to devolved, through to local. This is coordination of the various different bits of the problem here. It's monitoring and evaluation and kind of the process for adapting and improving policies as they go in. Not a lot of detail on those at the moment. But yeah, lots to do there. And then fair funding, we've had a review from the Treasury, which is nice as it goes. It's a nice kind of statement of lots of the principles and the economics and the realities of the problem that we face. It doesn't make a lot of decisions, unfortunately. So there's lots of decisions still to be made out there about how a lot of these things will be paid for and to be communicated about how they're going to be paid for. And then finally, integrating climate policy, which is now, it is clearly one of the government's key aims, but integrating it with all the other aims that we've got, climate adaptation, for biodiversity, for leveling up, getting back to the kind of skills point. There's a lot to be done in that space as well. Okay, and that's where I'll close. And I've just thrown up this to remind everyone that the reason we're doing all this is climate change. That's a very good reason to be going for net zero. But of course, the events in Ukraine at the moment, the crazy high gas prices, the new focus on energy security are another very good reason to go for net zero, because it is fundamentally about getting out of burning fossil fuels, oil and gas in the UK, given where we are on our coal journey already. So we'll have a spring statement from the Chancellor later today. We'll have an energy strategy at some point in the next week that the Prime Minister has promised. Those, I think, will double down again on net zero. That's absolutely the right thing to do. It would be mad to do anything different. But it is a new kind of force in the politics of this. So what we need to do now, though, is basically, it is the hard yards. It's the policy development, it's the consultation, the implementation, it's the working with different groups, and it's getting on, delivering it, and getting that money flowing, getting those low carbon choices to be made, and getting beyond blah, blah, blah. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Great presentation as always, and a lot of clarity there about the route map and importantly the difficulties. This is not a trivial process. We have time for a few questions to Mike. I'll just start by making one comment, which is about the 1,000 pages and actually spreadsheets too. Now, to most people, that's probably pretty irrelevant, but to a research community, it isn't. And those of you who don't look at the CCC's work, it is worth looking at, because the level of detail that's there, even if you disagree with it, it gives you a firm basis on which to make judgments. And I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to a lot clearer than Bayes ever produced.
It's easier, isn't it, depending on
Okay, yeah, that's nice of you to make excuses for them. Are there any questions to Mike?
I just say I've just put that because it's all on the website. So it's
Right.
pretty not the best, but it's pretty easy to find this stuff, I think.
I want to take Pete, even though you can talk next, Pete, but you can ask the question now.
We've bet the shop on negative emissions technologies, many of which aren't proven at great scale. What's the level of risk on that?
Yeah, like good question. I think I wouldn't say we bet the shop on it because we're throwing everything we've got at everything else as well in here. So I think it is kind of supplementary rather than central. What I will say is in here, that kind of green wedge that I showed you, very, very little of that is direct air capture. There is a small amount, it's not zero, but it's a couple of megatons out of the 800 that we're getting rid of. The vast majority of it is through the land sector, so it's planting of bioenergy, planting of trees. And then there's a question, once you produce some bioenergy, well, what do you do with it? Well, if you burn it in a CCS plant and you capture it and you bury it under the ocean, well, actually, that captures more of that carbon than any other thing that you can do with it, right? You don't want to be using it to displace petrol and diesel because you shouldn't be using petrol and diesel, right? You don't want to be using it to displace gas either. Because again, you shouldn't be using it, you should be using electricity. So it is deliberately supplementary. And I think that is definitely, it's an area where we need to keep holding the government's feet to the fire on it because I think it's an easy get out for them, right? This thing's not working, don't worry, we'll have more negative emissions. So I think absolutely right that the community keeps poking at it. We've tried not to rely on it, it's minimized in here.
Yes, sir.
With regard to manufacturing targets, I was wondering, is it with regard to consumption in the UK or manufacturing in the UK?
The UK targets are all territorial, so they're all about our emissions in the UK. The approach that we always very deliberately take is to consider what we should do on the basis of consumption emissions, actually. So you will see in here, there's quite a lot of resource efficiency, for example, which helps to cut UK emissions, but also some of our imported emissions. And we're very careful to recommend policy things that are about avoiding carbon leakage and making sure we're decarbonising UK manufacturing and not just pushing it overseas. Yeah, but really, again, really important in the implementation phase of this to get that right, because it's easy to kind of put that in a spreadsheet and to say that's what we're going to do, but to actually do it, you've got to design things very carefully. You've got to keep monitoring it, and you've got to keep tweaking.
Yeah, question there.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the talk. I'm Saiful Islam from Materials. It's good to hear you want to get beyond blah, blah, blah. I was thinking in terms of concrete action, you mentioned a list in the net zero strategies and plans and a phrase called fair funding. It's known that UK is always seen as really good at science and engineering, but we're doing it with a percentage of GDP below the OECD average. Are there any plans from this government to meet the OECD average? Even when we meet it, we'll probably be still behind, but will we actually, because then we'll be doing fantastic research in the UK.
Yeah, interesting. You know, there's a lot in the net zero strategy on innovation, actually. I think we probably worry more that innovation is seen as a kind of magic innovation tree. We don't need to do much because we'll put some money into research, put some money into innovation, and it'll all sort itself out, and that will be fine. And so I think you will often see a dynamic with CCC actually, where we kind of are sort of pushing back on that proposition because of that fear. But absolutely right, it makes complete, money put into research and put into innovation to bring down the costs to make these things more accessible to consumers is money well spent and will pay off very well. So there's lots in the net zero strategy, so it's definitely worth checking that out. But there's a whole. I think that's where we are on it. I think that don't assume it's a magic innovation tree, but do fund it properly.
Sarah.
Thank you very much. Sarah Darby from the Energy Programme at the Environmental Change Institute. It's a question, Mike, about joining things up, really, and implementation. If we're talking about public attitudes, basically, the public are on side, is my strong impression. I mean, there was a government survey, one of their regular trackers last summer. I think it was 72% for net zero. This is higher than the level of support for the monarchy or NATO, you know. The low carbon hub are besieged with calls for, you know, we're keen, we want to do something, what can we do? But joining it up is often really quite difficult. And one of the things that jumped out from your report last summer about on the government's progress was the need to link up central and local government, because the action is almost by definition going to have to be local. You know, the local authorities are the housing authorities, they're the transport authorities, they're the planning authorities, and they have the people around, you know, on the ground, in as much as they still have after all these cuts, you know, to advise people, to guide people and so on, and make stuff happen. So I wondered, you know, what your thoughts are about how that's going in terms of getting this connection up through central government, through local action, and to the public, and actually mobilising that level of public support.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, a really interesting set of points and question. I mean, badly is the short answer, I think, to how it's going at the moment. I'm sure Pete can say a bit more of that. But I agree, it's really fundamental. We're trying to put more resource into it, but we are constraining what we can do in a small organisation. We've put out a couple of papers on it that are interesting to look at. I think there's really good work out there. You know, the stuff UK 100 are doing, for example. You know, I think there's a fairly good understanding of what ought to happen. And the problem at the minute is, I think, building the political will within a central government, which is it's fundamentally antagonistic to local government, to get those to join up better. And it's not just local; it's devolved government as well, right? We have really strained relationships, kind of the UK government and Scottish and Welsh governments. And we need levers across all of those levels. And certainly, as you say, local government is much better positioned than central government to do a lot of the kind of the groundwork and a lot of the running and the kind of the hard yakka. I just one comment on the public engagement, the attitudes. I think in a way it's similar to the overall picture here, that the broad attitudes, absolutely pro net zero. Yeah, let's act on climate change. Everyone's bought into that. But when you get down to the next level, do they know what a heat pump is, right? Do they have any interest in taking any hassle to insulate their house? And you know, it's that level, I think, where the work is to be done. And that, I think, is the sort of stuff that a local government is much better placed to engage and to help on. But that takes time and it takes resources and it takes some kind of some leadership and enabling to be able to do it. So I think, you know, DLUC, the local government has got a lot of work to do here to help rather than kind of battling. Yeah, great point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We are going to have to end it there to keep the schedule, but thanks very much to Mike for such a great introduction to the day for us and the context for what we're all going to be talking about for the rest of the day and in many cases, the rest of our lives, I guess. But Mike, thank you. So I guess I should introduce myself before I go any further. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick Eyre. I chair the steering group for the Oxford Energy Network, so that's why I'm here helping us get through this session. And later on, my steering group colleague Malcolm will also be helping chair the session. So Mike's the last question and the last answer lead us very naturally to the next speaker. The next speaker is Pete Sudbury, who is a Green Party councillor in Oxfordshire, representing Wallingford. Importantly, he is the Climate and Environment Cabinet member in the still relatively new administration. I think Rainbow administration, we call it. But I have to say, I'm personally very encouraged to see a real change in attitude in the county council in the last year, a really positive approach to some of the issues that Mike's been talking about. So Pete, over to you to bring us the local dimension.
Thank you very much. Hope this is working. Right. Right, so that's me. Let's see if this works. Yeah. Okay, so, oh, it's the wrong way. Right, so Margaret Thatcher, 1989, talks about it is life itself that we must battle to preserve. And I shall come back to that later. It's a matter of considerable chagrin that the one thing she absolutely nailed and got completely right was the thing that got ignored. People spent hundreds of millions making sure we did ignore it, but the speeches she made were absolutely brilliant. So now I'll tell you a little bit about me, because it helps when you're thinking, where on earth is this person from, to understand their background. So this slide, I didn't make this slide, a black belt in PowerPoint did. So I read natural sciences in Cambridge and then medicine in Oxford. I was Dr. Pete in 1986, much more important. I was head of the river as well. And then I became a psychiatrist. And although I've retired, it doesn't really leave you. It's a bit like a stick of rock. The writing goes right to the end. I took my membership and as I got my consultant job, I was just finishing an MBA at Oxford Brookes, a part-time MBA, because I hadn't done enough exams by then. And then I became a manager and leader in the NHS, a clinical director and a medical director. I was on the National Clinical Advisory Team for a few years. I was really into clinical IT. I was mental health lead for the Southern Cluster of the National Programme for IT Learning, mostly how not to run a programme. It's a perfect object lesson, actually. Why do government IT projects fail? You could have me here and I will tell you all of it. I led the strategy for the first IT outsourcing in the NHS. We got Hewlett-Packard. I was not made the SRO for some peculiar reason and it didn't work. So I then fixed it. But by that time, my boss decided she didn't like innovators. So she put me on a secondment to Hewlett-Packard. And I was their health IT person. I was their health insider. And then I worked for them for 18 months as a consultant and loved it. Then I did an early retirement. And then I changed color. I got elected as a Green councillor. Nice visual joke there. And very, very recently, I was on a cabinet, which is a multicolour cabinet. So, and we called ourselves the Fair Deal Alliance. That was in the 21 council elections. The Greens and Lib Dems have an electoral pact. We stand down for each other and we gained 10 seats, which meant we could form an administration with the Labour Party. And it's the first time, in fact, that the Conservatives have been out of power completely since Oxfordshire County Council was formed in 18-something. And the unifying themes of that alliance are climate change and social justice. Those are the things that absolutely resonate right through all of the parties. So our agreed climate approach is that climate change is an absolutely cross-cutting issue. It cuts across everything we do. We framed it around the proposed climate and ecology bill, targets consistent with 1.5, conserve the natural world and justice, responsibility and fairness, which also resonate right across our alliance. And actually, it's quietly and very firmly radical. I'm the Green. I'm supposed to be the radical flanker. I have tried radically to outflank my cabinet colleagues, and it doesn't work. I say the most radical things, and people say, "Oh, yeah, good idea. Get on with it." That's a contrast, really, with the legacy climate approach, which is very much small N mitigation. It's the only our footprint, which is 13 kilotons of carbon, which is interesting but not significant. And I parodied that as sweating the small stuff. My predecessor, Yvonne Constance, left a very strong innovation background, some excellent community action groups. We've now got over 100 climate community action groups. And she commissioned a really extraordinary strategy, PASCO, Pathways to Zero Carbon Oxford. And I'm not just saying that because Nick wrote it. It is the most comprehensive plan ever developed to decarbonise Oxfordshire. It's not perfect, but perfection is a journey, not a destination, but it's a very good bit of work. Our immediate actions were to try and accelerate the LED conversion of streetlights, because streetlights, believe it or not, are 2/3 of all the energy that the Oxfordshire County Council uses. And I'm actually developing what you could call a dark skies policy that says we should turn streetlights off when we're not using them. In rural highways with blazing lights in the middle of the night, there's no one there. If we look at Oxfordshire's emissions, the emissions reduction 28 to 18 is not that great. And when you realize it's actually a freeloader strategy, you just sit and wait for the grid to decarbonize and tick the box and take the credit. And the biggest single use transport is over 50% of Oxfordshire's emissions. We're a rural county and transport is a big emitter. Just stepping back to PASCO, the headlines, oh God, I've just turned it off. That must be the, oh God, no. I'm trying to find the pointer. I've messed it up. Don't press the red button. There must be a button somewhere that's a pointer. Okay, anyway, never mind. The big thing here, as our colleague from the Climate Change Committee pointed out, 1.5 billion retrofit and heat pumps. That money is really not there at all. We got a grant for 2 million a few weeks ago. I think we need to get one of those a fortnight to to get that kind of investment. There's a big tree planting and habitat restoration, and actually our emerging sustainability policy is founded on preserving and enhancing the natural world. We need zero and negative emission new developments, which we haven't got, and we need to increase active travel. And finally, at the bottom of the thing we're talking about today is transformations in energy. And this is our net zero Oxfordshire plan. And as you can see, all of these are transport, because the big thing the county council is responsible for is transport. Transport, social care, and some of education are our big ticket things. And particularly like the local transport and connectivity plan has a target to reduce journeys by 25%, by a quarter by 2030, and by 2/3 by 2040. That's personal car journeys. At the side of the key strategies, the one I've put the ring around, the Oxfordshire Housing and Growth Deal does not enable a net zero Oxfordshire. It is in fact a carbon bomb. It builds 100,000 houses, and if Taylor Wimpey's analysis of the full carbon cycle chain is right, that's 250 tonnes per dwelling. And that actually swallows up Oxfordshire's entire 1.5-degree budget in one hit before anyone switches on a light bulb. And at the bottom there, if you ever get elected to a new council and you take over, it's the policies that matter. If you have a policy that says cut down every tree, an officer will take that policy and they will carry it out with perfect efficiency and be very proud of it. If you're, on the other hand, you have a policy that says plant loads of trees, they will do the same. You need to understand the policy. So we had one that said you can't plant a tree within 3 meters of a highway. That's gone now, but it took a while to find. So sweating the big stuff. In transport, the mantra is avoid, shift, improve. Okay, so the best journey is one you don't do at all. And the first thing we need to do is carry through on that legacy of COVID. Don't heed those siren voices that say, oh, why doesn't everybody go back to the office? Come back to the office when you need to. It is useful. But the default is work flexibly from home or from a local hub. The next thing, the shift. This is government policy. I put a question mark here because they put 3 million into buses, 3 billion into buses, then halved it. But there's 27 billion going into building roads, which doesn't quite match, does it? And there is a push and a pull here. So the pull is bus lanes and bus gates. If the bus can get places where you can't in your car, or the bus comes past you in a lane while you're sitting in a traffic jam, you think, maybe I'll take the bus. And then there's, if it's safe to cycle, which clearly isn't, you know, Oxford at the moment, then people will cycle. If there's an e-scooter you can pick up, you'll use that instead of the car, and so on. 90% of our emissions from transport are actually in rural areas. 50% of our population lives in Oxford, but they're only actually responsible for 10% of transport emissions. And it's the rural stuff we really need to hit. Just going on to the push, there's speed limits, traffic, all the things people shout about. Now, avoid and shift are much harder rurally. If you're in a rural area, you're likely to live further away from shops or work or whatever. It's harder to walk because there's no pavements. If you cycle, are you feeling lucky is often the feeling on country lanes. And so we need to really push on with improve. Oxfordshire is the highest county for EV adoption so far. And the barriers to EV adoption are the sticker price, the fact that it's more expensive when you look at it in the showroom, the charging network, and no off-street parking. So here we come to innovation. Now, the iHub. The iHub is a bit like a sweet shop, but it's not sweets, it's ideas. It's got all these ideas, or like Q and James Bond, you know, hey, Bond, do you want future energy systems? Here they are, try not to wreck them. And like many things, it's a really outstanding place. And like many of the great things in the county council, it's a well-kept secret. Shifting to EVs, park and charge. So we're setting up, and they'll be finished, this will be finished by the end of April, be 20 charging hubs in county towns. So we're setting them up round exactly where people will need them. You can park and charge your car free overnight if you don't have access on street or off street parking. And it's a big project being delivered on time. The chargers themselves are actually designed and built and operated in Oxfordshire. So it's a local company benefiting from this. They're fast chargers. You could tap and go with a card. You can join up Easy Charge, and that gives you slightly cheaper tariffs. The tariffs are not punitive. So it's not like if you go to a Shell or a BP station, it'll actually cost you more per mile to fill your EV than it would to fill your petrol car. And then next thing, Oxgully. For years, I had a Tesla for several years, and then it got stolen and burnt out at the beginning of lockdown. And I thought, if you're a green, your next car needs to be electric. The one after that should be a bike. So I got an e-bike. But for years, I thought, if only we had those things like where the drain pipes come off the roof and they go underneath the pavement, wouldn't that be brilliant? And I said that when I got to county council, someone said, yes, we've got that. And there it is. That's all it is. It just lets you take your cable from a wall charger and underneath the pavement without people tripping. Although the one at the back does look a bit like it's a snare, doesn't it? But never mind. Again, it's UK Innovate funded, and local authorities, anyone interested, this should be ready to, we're piloting it, it should be ready to be rolled out from later this year. And all this needs us to change the electricity system. You double electricity demand. Okay, so heating is 3 times as efficient, 3 or 4 times as efficient if you use electricity. EVs are 3 or 4 times as power efficient, but there's still a lot of power needed. There's also the change in supply. You're changing from huge generators in one place that just drone on for 24 hours to distributed and intermittent. And the big things are technological and regulatory, commercial, but there's also social change. Customers turn from being a passive consumer to an active participant in a dynamic system. And that's what Project Leo is about. It looks at how you involve citizens as part of this. It looks at the knowledge base. It looks at basically writing the manual. And then it looks at how you write the policies and enable it. And the great thing about it, as somebody said, the great thing about Project Leo is we wrote it all down. Didn't just experiment, they wrote down the experiments. And so actually you can pick it up and take it somewhere else. Flexible energy allows you to smooth out the curves, the peaks and troughs in supply and the peaks and troughs in demand. It massively reduces the costs compared to your huge monolith generators. If you had to double the electricity supply with monolithic generators, you have to put in these enormous pipes to take the electricity around the country. If you can generate it locally and use it locally, it's much more efficient. There's lots of innovation potential, and there's grid resilience. And that's important. So the recent UK adaptation report, funnily enough, the risks are all expressed in terms of cost, money, as though money is the risk you're worried about. But one of the very high risks is cascading failure of water, energy, transport, ICT. And actually, if you think about it, the energy bit is the linchpin of the hinge there. If the electricity supply goes down, you can't pump water, you can't drive your electric vehicle, and your ICT clearly doesn't work. And high risk is climate-related grid collapse, particularly in hot weather. Grids don't like hot weather. And so if you have flexible distributed energy and storage assets, you can increase resilience. My house, we have solar panels all over it, and we also have a whole stack of repurposed lead acid batteries that came out of forklift trucks. So if the power goes down, we've got 2 or 3 days supply. So we are a resilience node in Woodcote. Actually, when you scale that up, when you've got lots of behind the meter storage, when you've got vehicle to grid, you can keep a local grid going for a long time without connecting it to anything else. And that might be very useful in the future. The research stuff focuses a lot on the marketplace, it's like the softer stuff about supporting it and how you bring the citizens in and make sure that citizens profit from this too. Once you've got an electric car, you can profit from vehicle to grid technology. And there's lots of data insight and mapping. These maps are lovely. So these are where there are local energy plans. You can baseline total annual energy use by area, percentage of households not connected to gas, and households in fuel poverty. You can say, oh, look, this is where we're going to build houses. That's where it's a great idea to try and generate solar. How about we put solar by the homes in some places or on top of the homes in other places? It just tells you the best place to do this. Similarly, reducing demand. So you've got your annual electricity use, and then you've got a heat map of the buildings that are shoving heat out through their roofs. And that gives you a target list of things you might want to insulate. And that's the information on that. You want that now. And the interesting evidence here, one of the tricks with strategic management actually is understanding that good models don't travel well. You can't just lift and shift them. You put it down in a different place, it doesn't quite work because every place is slightly different. The people are different, the way things work are different, the times people work and so on. And what this has done, this paper actually demonstrates that if you take an approach that looks at the individual place and plans around it, it's twice the benefit and it's lower cost. That's to die for in business terms, isn't it? You'd be really happy if you got that. You get additional energy savings and you get wider social benefits. All this is a bit like a T3 magazine. Anybody know T3 magazine? It's gadget porn. Basically, my wife buys me a subscription every year. It's full of things like 100 gadgets you can't live without. Spoiler: you can live without them. But you know, all the same, it's all great fun. This is the future. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And yet, I can't be the only person here who isn't thinking, didn't we need to be here 10 years ago? Didn't we need now to have a fully decarbonized grid? Didn't we need to have 50% electric vehicles out there now? Didn't we need emissions to be coming down now? Because the future is here. It's here in Germany. It's here in China. That's Lytton burning. That's near Lytton flooding. Okay, that's the future, and it's arriving. So, and if we do a stock take, the yellow and green lines are the ones we'd like to be on, and we're really not very close to that. Really, really far off. This is your greenhouse gases. Since COVID, even the proverbial man on the Clapham omnibus can recognize an exponential and knows it's a very bad thing to be on if it's going in the wrong direction. So these are not the most comforting. You wouldn't tell your children a bedtime story about these, would you? And this Michael Mann, the hockey stick chap, I follow him on Twitter, and he actually answers questions if you asked him. And I asked him about this, and this is what he said. So ice melt, sea level rise, extreme weather events, and the hammock changes are all going much faster than expected, and he used those words. That you really don't want to hear that, do you? It says temperature is going exactly as predicted. In fact, it's going exactly as 2 Exxon scientists predicted in 1981. They got it right within 0.1 degree and 10 parts per million of CO2. That's how good we've been at controlling this. That's how good we've been at listening to Margaret Thatcher. And the UK adaptation strategy says plan for 2 degrees, but maximum and up to 4 degrees. That is not great news, is it? So you're planning for something that's, and the IPCC one says most of these adaptation things get less effective over 2 degrees. So this is, it might not be a perfect storm, but it's working hard on it. And Professor Sir Dieter Helm recently talked to Wild Oxfordshire, and he was saying we've got very little chance of hitting 1.4, no chance of hitting 1.5, and very little chance of hitting 2. This is potentially really globally awful. That's what he said. And that's why it's potentially, one of the reasons it's potentially really globally awful is actually 1 to 3 degrees, you get the yellow ice sheets collapsing and Arctic summer sea ice, which accelerates heating. You go into the 3 to 5 degrees and you start to get forest collapse. You start to get very, very, very big emissions of carbon. And you begin to get a system that's self-sustaining. You can cut your anthropogenic emissions and the forests will carry on doing it for you. And get to the red ones and you really don't want to be there. We think about it, the Permian mass extinction, the biggest mass extinction in history, was runaway global warming caused by exactly this kind of feedback loop. So I think we need to ask, what would we do if climate and ecological emergency really was an emergency? If this was a business and you had it on a business risk matrix, probability high, impact catastrophic, it'd be at the top right in the purple bit. And everybody would be going absolutely batshit to try and stop it. But we're not. You need a conceptual shift from what is possible to what is necessary. Not this. These are the COPs, all lined up with a steadying increase in carbon dioxide. That's pathetic, actually. Revisit your assumptions. I think the least cost pathway is the equivalent to saying, are you feeling lucky? Are you feeling it? Will it be okay to spend the money only then? Wait till 2035 before you ban particular types of pumps. It's not a business decision, it's a risk management decision. We should be looking at the least risk pathway. There are only two problems with net zero by 2050. The first is net zero, which allows you to cheat. You can live in a cardboard box with an oil boiler and put a huge solar panel on the roof and call it net zero. And by 2050 is a random and arbitrary target. This is a bit of Oxfam research that gave me that I had real trouble with, because what it shows, it's deciles on the top 10% of people, which is people earning over about the UK median wage, are responsible for 50% of the emissions in the 25 years after Margaret Thatcher spoke, and 50% of the emissions and 50% of the emissions growth. The problem is here, now, it's us, not people in China or India, it's us. And okay, with the problem, we can also be the solution. We also have to tackle the delusional idea that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet. So these are the shared socio-economic pathways. There are two of them, SSP 1.9 and 2.6, that hit 2 degrees. Both of them require economies to switch from growth to well-being. You can't have growth and a livable planet. GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Tell us everything about America except why we're proud to be Americans. These are my daughters. That's at Extinction Rebellion in 2019. They're not really contributing to the economy. All their kit is pretty much hand-me-downs, including the hats. We may have bought the shades. And they make my life worth living. Before you ask, yes, I am a late developer. I got married late, had kids late. My son is 12. In his lifetime, a quarter of all anthropogenic emissions have hit the atmosphere in 12 years. That's why we needed to be here 10 years ago. So the mission, this is God. This is God, or God through Joel saying, I will restore to you the years the locusts have eaten. Churchill referenced this in one of his speeches. Unfortunately, God also signed up to free will quite early on, and she's probably been regretting it ever since. In fact, if God was a woman, she probably wouldn't have been stupid enough to sign up to giving men free will, would she? But we are 10 years behind the curve, and we need to catch it up. And our opponent is going exponentially. So linear isn't good enough. So whatever you're doing, whatever we're doing, we need to think, how do we double it? And then double it again, or scale it by 10, and then scale it by 10 again, and keep doing that until either we beat this thing, or we run out of time, or we run out of hope. This is an epilogue. This is David Attenborough. That's easily our epitaph. And that epitaph is being written every day, right now. And at some point, we all need to stop it. But the people in this room are particularly gifted and able to do that. If not us, who? If not now, when? Thank you very much. Oh, I should stay up here, yes.
But yeah, Oxfordshire to the world. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Anybody, I hope you can stay for the rest of the day, and I'm sure you're going to get people.
I'm certainly here till I have to get the 1:50 bus because I have to hook my children out of school.
So if you've got any questions about difficult things like low traffic neighbourhoods outside the meeting, might be a better place to do them. But any questions more relevant to the big picture? Yeah, Radhika.
Hey, thanks. That was great. I have a question about the circle you do around Oxfordshire housing and growth here. So all the urgency that you laid out at the end of your presentation, how do we square that with this sort of booming real estate, and what are we doing about that?
If there was a way of throwing a grenade and making it stop, you would do that. Unfortunately, the way the planning rules are written, it's a bit like the laws of thermodynamics, isn't it? You can't win, you can't draw, you can't get out of the game. Well, with housing, the developers always win. Whatever you do, developers can build houses. If you try and stop them building houses in one place, they collapse the land supply, and then they say, right, there's not enough houses being built. And they can build houses anywhere they like, and they can build anything they like anywhere they like. So you are absolutely over a barrel. So what you can do is work with the industry, because the guy from Taylor Wimpey, who told us about 250 tons per house, he's got kids as well. He lives on the same planet as us. And actually, there is a massive social change from many people denying this and saying it's nothing to do with us, to almost everybody now thinking this is a serious problem. It was the elephant in the corner that a lot of people didn't want to talk about and nobody talked about, to the elephant in the corner that's making a very loud noise now. And so the building industry themselves want to make progress. And I now see at parish council meetings, there's developers coming and I say, how are you heating the house? And they say heat pumps. They say, yeah, and we're doing triple glazing and so on. So developers are beginning to move forwards and reduce their carbon footprint, looking to do that. And I think that's all we can do. We can work as hard as we can. We can say to them, you guys are crashing the planet. How about you work out how to stop? It's not a great answer, but politics is the art of the possible. I could say, have a revolution, glue yourself to the M25. Yes, those might help, but I've never been that fond of revolutions. They tend to backfire.
Thanks, Pete. We'll end it there,
Okay.
but thank you very much. And I not only is Pete going to be here for some of the rest of the day, of course, he is here for the next few years for us to talk to. So thank you very much. We're now going to move on to some snappy presentations on some of the bigger and cross-cutting programs in energy research in the university. Just to remind all my colleagues, 12 minutes, that includes time for questions. So anybody overrunning, we will stop because we do want to keep the schedule. And we're going to start with a presentation by my colleague Malcolm McCulloch on the Integrate programme, which ended yesterday. Malcolm.
Thanks, Nick. So this session, we're just going to go through a quick fire through the programs, and the one we're starting with is Integrated Renewable Energy. What's interesting is it was set up in October 2015 in response to a Martin School call for Global Collins collective responsibilities and market failures. And I think listening to Pete's summary of where we are, I think, collective responsibility and market failures is exactly where we are. And so that was really interesting. But what's kind of salient to think about is in 2015, it was pre-Ukraine, pre-COVID, pre-net zero, pre-Brexit, and pre-Paris. So actually quite a lot has changed since then. And yet I think we got our research question pretty well nailed. It's kind of stood the test of time, is to say, given this critical 21st century challenge on how do we transition to zero energy systems, what are the combined technical, economic, governance challenges that are there, and how do we integrate renewable systems into every part of our electricity system? And one of the things we recognize is that actually, it's not the research question, it's not the laboratories, it's the people that are the critical resource that enable us to really make a difference. And over our period, we've had a fantastic group of people that have been working together on this particular problem. And these researchers have been working across multiple disciplines, and we've developed a very strong interdisciplinary ethos where we've been challenging each other on what we mean by certain words and also what's on certain concepts. And this has been especially borne out in our regular seminars where we continually have the challenge to the speaker to say that we will be asking insightful questions so that they never get to the end of their presentation. So if you want to start asking questions now, you can follow up. And we've been using the Modern School, which has been fantastic in giving us a home space, which is in kind of neutral territory. And one of the things that we've been really, we found really challenging, but really good in a challenging way, is how do we get this multidisciplinary aspect right? And it starts off by recognizing that just because the way we think might be good for us, it doesn't mean it's necessarily the right and only way to think. And so you've got to look across to say the person sitting across from you might be an economist or a physicist or a lawyer or an engineer. They also have something interesting to contribute to that and to listening to that. And I think you heard Nick saying earlier on is to say that one of the things we're saying is to say, how do we translate these ideas into real practical solutions? And that means it's got to be good enough and it's got to be realistic and not ideal. And the last thing is to recognize is that whole systems was absolutely key. I think we've mentioned, right at the beginning, we're saying is actually how do you coordinate multiple people together and how do you get a whole systems approach working? Because if you get one piece getting going, then you often find another piece then stops you from working in it. So what are we, a lot of our early thinking, which is critical, was to talk about what do we mean by whole systems thinking? And typically at the time when we talked about whole systems, the general comment was to say generation and networks was whole systems. We included that to include what is the resource from that you're getting the generation from, storage, networks, and consumers or the edge, the grid edge. But again, it's not just a single line because again, a lot of people are thinking it's about the technology development in each of those areas was key. But we recognize is that technology development is one of four key aspects. It's the market arrangements, social engagement, and institutions governance. And I think now we'd also include aspects such as the infrastructure is actually going to be really key as well. And it's not just that these are acting in isolations that actually interact with each other. And that's where that's for me is the whole systems diagram, is to say where these verticals now start to interact with them. And what we often find is the different research projects we had, they wouldn't just be at one intersection, they'd be in multiple intersections. And that's where the really interesting thing comes together. And so where do I think we are now? This is my kind of view this is my personal views to say, where do you think we're getting to? So I think, in terms of resources and technology, yeah, okay, that's going. But if you look at institutions and governance and resources, I think we're thinking, and the acronym WTF might come to mind. Just to actually say, how do we actually put everything together? If you look at, consumers and market arrangements, we're all kind of sweating at the moment. So I think, this is kind of shows us where we are at the moment. And there are not very many happy pictures in there. What's interesting is I did the same graph 6 months ago. And there are a lot more happier faces than there are today. And that just kind of shows you what a energy shock does for you. It really does start to say, and also lack of progress and that's happened. So what do we think are some of the great things that come out of Integrate? Well, the first thing was that the seminars were really amazing because we really teased out some really good underpinning concepts from each speaker. And actually quite a lot of the speakers felt rather daunted to say that they're going to be challenged to all the time to not get to the end. So some of them cheated and only gave us 5 slides. We still stopped them. But what they found is they actually gained a lot of it because there was really good, thorough discussion from a cross-disciplinary perspective. And actually, most of our speakers came away saying, actually, we learned something as well from that. And it wasn't just one person standing up and saying, okay, this is the answer. Rather, this is the question, and here are some of the answers that we need to get on. The second thing was language as a barrier was really challenging. I'm going to just take a simple word we've used already, prosumer. What do we mean by prosumer? By the way, our default answer came out to be is a end user who is proactive in the energy system, but also things like efficiency. So engineers were thinking about efficiency in terms of the amount of power out versus the amount of power in. Whereas economists were thinking fish in terms of the amount of value created per dollar spent. And so that was kind of interesting. We got a large number of papers, over 97 papers, and over 50% were joint authorship across multiple departments. And that was really interesting because normally multidisciplinary research is seen as a death knell in academia because you're not powering on the discipline. But actually what we found is that the interface across the different disciplines gave the really interesting questions, which then addressed the needs of those specific disciplines. So that was really great. We also, through some wonderful work of our people such as Helen Gowan, is we managed to get 22 videos out, 121 blogs, and 220 newsletters. And considering this was designed as a 3-year program, but if you think about it, we actually started in 2015 and we finished yesterday. We've extended it by a few years just because we've leveraged other funding. It's not a bad output. But also, not only that, it's inspired a whole lot of other activities. So the future of cooling, which Radhika will come through, there's some ideas that have spanned across to that. Project Leo, which has been mentioned, comes out, and a lot of ideas come through there. Work together with Peter Bruce and others on the Faraday Institute. Some of the ideas came through here. CREDS, which is what Nick runs, is again quite a lot of the ideas and institutes come through there. We've been doing low-cost grids in Africa, and that project was inspired by the whole idea of you got to move energy through both space and time. And we'll talk later on about what the last one talks about. If you haven't had a chance to look at our synthesis report, please do so because there's some wonderful insights in there. I've given you a short form link to it. And I did a word cloud of what all the words come through. And not surprisingly, you saw electricity and energy is coming things, but you've got demand, policy, market storage, efficiency, drivers, all sorts of things in there. The DOI comes up really high because of the large number of applications we've got. So we've got the DOIs of everything. So that's why that's there. But I think what I really want to say is we want to give special thanks to James Martin, who unfortunately died before our program actually started, but he is the benefactor for the Oxford Martin School, and he had the vision to say we need to address the 21st century challenges in a multidisciplinary way, and the Martin School have really carried that legacy on strongly, so we really want to thank them. Thank you very much.
A couple of questions, a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody's got any.
Well, that's fine. Quick, you all want some tea, so let's move on.
So next up is Cameron, and at this point, I'm going to hand over to Malcolm to chair the rest of the session.
Right. Thanks, Nick. So Cameron, welcome to this, and you're going to be inspiring us about your post-carbon transition program.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Hello, everyone. So yes, I'm here to report on the Oxford Mountain program on the post-carbon transition, and many of the things Malcolm just said about the support of the Martin School, the physical space, the vision of Jim Martin and Lillian, and actually Charles and I think Achim Steiner, who was director at the time, all apply here too. They've been great support for this program. Matt Ives, who's actually literally just left to run half of South Australia, was running most of the program while he was here. So he's rather happy about how it's ended up for him. And he's actually got a remit to take many of the ideas that we had over the course of this program and put them into practice in the state of South Australia. But let me give you a bit of a sense of what we were doing, perhaps a bit more on the content, less on the process. So early on, actually in the proposal for this program, we thought that we would propose and then frame the research around this idea of sensitive intervention points. So if you think of our socio-economic technical system as a complex system, and we need to move that complex system and completely rewire it to get to a post-carbon world, how do we accelerate that process of change? Where are the intervention points that are sensitive in the sense that they will give you a significant positive response for a modest input? So that was the kind of framing idea. And then we developed that idea in multiple different ways over the course of the few years. And as you'll see, there's been more money that's come in since, and possibly an even bigger chunk to come in a couple of months. So while the program is in principle, you know, close to completion, it's a bit like Malcolm's story. It may yet go on for another 5 years because whether we like it or not, we're not quite post-carbon yet, as events of the last little while have shown us. We took advantage, in a sense, of the pandemic to say, okay, well, here is a moment. Here is a reorganization of physical and social systems. We should think about this through the lens of getting to net zero. So there's several papers and lots of engagement with over 20 different governments on the green recovery idea, and a new project across the university spawned from this project. I'll say a little bit about how we've applied the idea of SIPs in some different regions. And just because Mike's here, in his honor, talk about the Committee on Climate Change, and because as you will have heard from Mike, they're very thoughtful and on the frontier group. So they pick up on new ideas and apply them, and so we are able to apply the idea in the CCC context, and then set out how it's been used in Oxford courses in education. We had a competition and a wiki. I can see the yawns already, so let me get cracking. So the basic idea is that you do have in social systems these radical changes. You can call them tipping points, you can call them leverage points, you can call them sensitive intervention points. So here's the fall of the Berlin Wall, where in a sense, the system was at a state of criticality. You know, things had been bubbling up, the tension was there, and then it just took, it wasn't a few people bashing a wall down, but it did, you know, it's the grain of sand at 38 degrees that triggers the avalanche, that leads to a change in the way we think about how to organize society, and then a change across Europe, in this case, for economics and for politics. And what we're looking for in this case is, are there SIPs, are there points where the system is near criticality, where we can intervene to accelerate change on climate? And very early on, we identified two different sorts of SIP, two different sorts of intervention. So one is where your system is a little bit like this. You're sitting here, you're the red ball. Here's the, the topology of the system. And if you give it a little kick, you can overcome activation energy. Those of you who are chemists will kind of recognize that. And then off you go, rolling down to your kind of exothermic end at the, I mean, there are many different analogies we can explore here, whether from politics or physical chem, or skiing. Yes, there you go, right. So clearly it's a non-linear effect, because you put in a little bit of effort here and you get a lot back for it. The other sort of intervention that we were exploring with these shifts, where you don't necessarily move, quite hard to disentangle these two, to be perfectly honest with you, but you're not moving the ball, but you're shifting the topology of the system itself. So these are more fundamental changes. We in fact argue that the emergence and the existence of the Committee on Climate Change, or the Climate Change Committee, it's now called, is a shift, because it changes the incentives of the actors in the system in a more fundamental way. So that's what we were looking for. We did what academics do and wrote lots of papers, and the papers were across a range of domains, whether legal, historical, because we had Jane Humphreys, a historian, in this program. That's the joy of the Martin School programs, is they're always multidisciplinary, as well as the technological, the political, the geopolitical, and the human behavioral dimensions. And then, as I mentioned, we took advantage of the pandemic, in a sense, to try to find the SIPs that might be available, that weren't previously available, to get because when governments around the world are spending $20 trillion on recovering, rescuing and recovering their economies, there's a risk that some of that ends up being wasted. Of course it was, but we were in there at least making the case to use it in a structurally sensible way. If you're going to put all this money out the door, think a little bit ahead and don't just pump up your existing fossil fueled systems, use it to trigger the transformation. So I'm not sure we completely succeeded there, but the way I look at it, if we moved the dial on 1% more of that 20 trillion, which is probably about all we did, in a sense, that's still 200 billion. It's not every day you get to move 200 billion US, so it's worth the effort. Now, one of the immediate follow-throughs from this Oxford Martin program has been the ICE program, the Economics of Energy Innovation and System Transition, which is a UK government funded program. It's about £3 million, joint with Cambridge and Exeter, Anglia Ruskin, and a bunch of other universities, that we've started to take these ideas about the energy transition and get into partnership with Chinese, Indian, and Brazilian scholars. The idea being that one of the interventions that could be very significant here is in our own heads. It's how we think about and model the transition. And if we can change our own beliefs about how this transition will happen and how quickly it will happen. Beliefs in social systems have a habit of potentially becoming self-fulfilling. So for instance, if you believe the IEA's numbers, and I should stop shooting at the IEA, but anyway, if you believe their numbers that actually there's going to be vast amounts of fossil still in the system in 2050 because the cost of renewables isn't going to fall a jot from what it is today, then of course investors will make investments accordingly and they will put capital into the fossil system. If you believe instead that the cost of renewables is coming down quickly, I see Kings Mill here, it's nice to have you here. One of the narratives, you've been changing beliefs here. If you see that belief as being credible, then there is no space. It's just not logical to invest vast sums of money into a fossil system. So one intervention is just to change people's beliefs and the capital flows accordingly. It's maybe a softer way of delivering change, but no less important, possibly more important for that. So that project is ongoing now as a kind of extension to the post-carbon transition program. And actually, before I go into the CCC, I'll just say we're midway through some discussions with a philanthropic fund to scale this up. So we started with 2 minutes. Yeah, okay. I've got a sign there, but thank you. To scale this up quite dramatically by another order of magnitude. So we're talking tens of millions of dollars into changing the way these financial ministries in the largest 20 countries, the biggest emitters, think about the future, how they model the future, and hence, hopefully, how the capital flows accordingly. So watch this space. May or may not have good news in a couple of months. With the Committee on Climate Change, the committee has a set of advisory groups, and a policy advisory group was established a couple of years ago that then took the idea of SIPs and the post-carbon transition project and applied it to the UK's transition to net zero, coming up with 40 different potential interventions. Didn't expect all of them to be fully endorsed in 9 different buckets. The most annoying and satisfying thing in equal measure about doing this report was that we had to do quite a lot of last minute changes because the Prime Minister came out with his 10-point plan, which stole, that's how I like to put it, stole a lot of our ideas. I know he'd seen a draft copy, so it could just be fluke, but it might not have been. Okay, then in the education side of things, again, a big intervention. How do you change hearts and minds for the future? Well, you make sure they're understanding things accurately today. There's a new sustainable law program using the law as a weapon, effectively, to accelerate change here. Not in a nasty way, but we need to make sure that those interests who would be advancing the status quo are making sure they're following the law, they're meeting their fiduciary obligations, and they're meeting all of the requirements, now legal requirements, to get to net zero. So the law is a useful tool here. And there is now a module in the new MSc at the Smith School that takes these ideas and teaches them. And then finally, we have had a range of other outreach. So this is a perhaps more traditional outreach, and it was a conference. But it was an unusual conference because it was a pandemic conference. So rather than get everybody together in one location, people came together for the Climate Neutrality Forum in Oxford, in Berlin, in Milan, and in Brussels as hubs that were connected. And there was a set of 6 weekly seminars, each on different potential intervention areas. And you can see some of the areas there, some of them, kind of stunningly general, perhaps not very surprising, but there are some more detailed and quite interesting things in that too. And Malcolm, if I may, just before I wrap up, what's been surprising to me about this idea is just how much it's galvanized people's attention. I mean, I had many people say to me, I've been doing this my entire career, I just didn't call it that. And others say, well, of course, this is how we need to think about the problem. And I think sometimes they're thinking, well, this is entirely obvious. Does it really take a bunch of Oxford academics to point this out? And they're right. It is entirely obvious. Of course, we should be thinking about it this way. But sometimes it does take somebody to point out the blindingly obvious, and then we can get on and do it. So anyway, thank you very much. It's been a good journey. Disappear.
Any questions for Cameron? Yes.
Since you did this on COVID, could Putin's war and the removal of the world's largest fossil fuel supplier be actually a much bigger driver of SIPs?
It is a great question, and it's going to take me more than 30 seconds to answer it properly. But yes, I mean, what we're seeing, as you know, is a kind of more energy of all kinds strategy being adopted by the West. So more renewables, more storage, more installation, although not enough of that, but also more gas, more oil, more nuclear. And so the negative side of things is you just have a reshuffling of the markets. So the Russians now supply the Indians and the Chinese, who are not buying from the States and the Middle East, and the Middle Eastern gas and oil and the American stuff shifts into Europe, and Europeans pay a higher price and those guys pay a lower price, but actually not a lot changes. So that's not great. And then there'll be additional infrastructure investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. But at the same time, I think we will have, we've seen it in the energy strategy coming out next week, or what's been leaked at least of it, a big impetus, big new push on renewables and in nukes. I mean, we just did some research yesterday pointing out that since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the UK has transferred 22 billion pounds to Russia for oil and gas, which is roughly the cost of 8,000 T-14 Russian tanks. I'm making no judgment or causal statement. I'm just pointing out the equivalence between those numbers. Yeah. So, but I think you're right. There's probably quite a lot of good thinking to be done here. I suspect you're probably doing something.
Great. Thanks a lot, Cameron.
Thanks, everyone.
Our next speaker is Peter Bruce, who many of you will know, and he's going to be talking about his work on the Faraday Institution.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, and it's a great pleasure to be here. The Oxford energy community is one that's grown since I moved here, I guess, in 2014, and it's fantastic that it's still so thriving. And I think it's been a real glue that has brought what is often a disparate community in Oxford in research together in very imaginative ways. So it's great to be part of that. So my task for the next sort of 8 to 10 minutes is to tell you something about the Faraday Institution, and especially the Faraday Institution's links with Oxford. So that's what I'm going to endeavour to do. Because I'm not using my own laptop, I don't have this fancy thing that you can point to all screens simultaneously. So if I do point to something, and my apologies, it'll be one screen at a time. So the Faraday Institution, what is it? It is the UK's research centre for electrochemical energy storage. It's a virtual centre. There's a small headquarters at Harwell, but all the research is carried out within the university community. And that was a very deliberate plan when we set this up. You can see I've got 3 roles there. I was the founder and the chief scientist of the Faraday Institution. I'm also physical secretary of the Royal Society. Of course, most importantly in this community, I'm a member of the materials at Oxford. But it was set up very deliberately because we wanted to get up and running quickly. We didn't want to take a lot of time to buy lots of expensive equipment and put up a building. It takes 3 or 4 years, et cetera, because this is an urgent problem that we have to address. And of course, it also helps to put money into people rather than into equipment, because there's always a finite size to the cake, unfortunately. The reality is, if you spend more on one thing, you have to spend less on another. So it spends most of its budget on research, but it also carries out these functions of skills development, which is very important in a rapidly transitioning environment, industrially, economically. There's always a problem of getting enough people with the right skills to actually deliver on the mission. It carries out market analysis, and it also carries out early stage commercialization. So something of the scale and scope of it. We were in leveling up before the phrase was coined. And that was another advantage of this virtual nature of the center, because we do have certain level of geographical reach. Now, you can all look at the map and you can all see that it isn't quite evenly distributed. I completely acknowledge that. But we do get to quite far, reaching areas, right up to the north of Scotland up here, one or two of our industrial partners. So, and the serious point here, that the benefit of a virtual center is that you can rapidly embrace people in other geographical locations. You don't have to put something up, persuade people to move, etc., etc. So what is the scale? So the red dots represent our 20 academic partners, and the blue dots, the dark blue dots, the industrial partners, of which we have 50 and 20 academic institutions involved. And this little ladder here gives you some other statistics. We have 9 principal investigators that lead our major projects, 12 project leaders. Those are the people who really do the work on the day-to-day management of those projects. 122 co-investigators, 180, in fact, more than 180 postdocs, and more than 135 PhD students. And that's since we started in 2017. So it's quite a rapid rise, 470 researchers overall. That just gives you something of the scale and scope within the UK. We also are very much developing an international profile and an international outreach and building bridges and collaborations internationally. Some more numbers or some more data here. 30% of people working on these projects are female. It's not enough, but it's better than many areas in the physical sciences and engineering sciences. One very positive thing, I think, is this last bullet point. If you look at the people involved in the research programs that the Faraday Institution funds, now I should be clear, it's not a funding agency. It's not there purely to hand out money. It's not an alternative to UKRI in that sense. It does give out money, but it also manages the programs and coordinates the programs and thinks about what the big challenges are in electrochemical energy storage that should be addressed by the UK research community. But the 65% is important because 65% of the people working in these projects now were not really working in this area of electrochemical energy storage in the UK before. So we've been able to have a mechanism that encourages, enables, allows people to move from some of the areas they have been working in and work in these areas. And the conventional funding systems in the UK, not deliberately, but perhaps by accident, unintended consequences, tend to make that very difficult. Very hard to move into new fields and get funding in a conventional system. I think that's one of the things that we've been able to achieve. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about a few of the programs, the ones that are particularly relevant to Oxford, the ones that Oxford has a significant stake in. It won't be an exhaustive list, so apologies if I've missed anything out. I'll just talk about 2 or 3 of these. I won't talk about CatMat because one of my new colleagues, Saiful Islam, who's there, Saiful, who joined Materials just in January, who leads CatMat, I think is talking this afternoon. So I'll leave that one to him. So the research projects, the large ones, and these are multidisciplinary projects. They're teams of maybe 15 to 20 co-investigators with a similar or larger number of postdocs and students in each team. You can divide it into 3 areas. Work on lithium ion batteries. So most of the focus is on lithium technology and sodium technology. So lithium ion batteries, that's a present day technology. It's in EVs. If it weren't around, I guess we wouldn't have the development of EVs that we have. And within the lithium ion battery space, so this is existing technology where we're hoping that the research that's carried out will actually feed through into positive commercial advantage in a relatively short time scale. We have these projects. Degradation, which the word implies, looks at how batteries fail, why they don't last longer, why you can't get more cycles out of them. Multi-scale modeling, which I will talk about a little bit more. in a moment. So the ones in the dark ones are the ones I've picked out, where Oxford has a significant stake. Relib is about recycling, repurposing, and the circular economy. Hugely important. I think we launched this program right at the beginning, back in 2018, when it wasn't quite on the same radar as it is now, but we all recognize the challenge of recycling, largely because of mineral availability. And without getting too political about it, I'm far less concerned about competing with the Chinese in technologies than I am about recognizing that they're buying up a lot of the minerals around the world. And we're going to find 10 or 20 years down the track that it'll be very hard to access some of those minerals that we need for low carbon technologies. Certainly the market will be probably determined by the Chinese. So recycling and recovering materials that we can use again, hugely important. FutureCat and CatMat address positive electrode materials in lithium ion batteries. The battery has three key components: a negative electrode, positive electrode, and an electrolyte in between. There's a lot of effort around the positive electrode, the cathode, because that's one of the big barriers to increasing energy storage and therefore driving range of an EV. Nextroad is looking at new and smarter ways of making batteries, making lithium ion batteries, particularly the electrodes, and I'll talk about that briefly. Don't worry, for those of you who are not in science and technology, this will be definitely technology light. There's nothing to worry about here. And then SafeBat, well, the name, I guess, speaks for itself, battery safety. Then we have SolBat. This is the program that I lead, and this is on solid-state batteries, so I'll say a little bit about that. LiStar is about the lithium sulfur battery. NextGenna deals with sodium-ion batteries, which has the potential to be cheaper, and perhaps particularly interesting for certain levels of grid-scale storage. It's at the small end of the storage market, if you like, for grids, for ancillary services, very important. And then we have some other projects here, which are more focused on overseas activities. So we do have programs that are very much focused and with countries in Africa, etc. And we're developing that to an even greater extent. Okay, so what do we, let's look at one or two of these projects. So SolBat, solid state batteries. It's a consortium between Oxford, Sheffield, Liverpool, Warwick, and UCL. And the challenge in realizing a solid state battery, and it's regarded as the sort of next big thing in batteries, is really one of interfaces. When you put two solids together and one of them might change its volume and the other one doesn't, you have a big challenge. And that is, in a sentence, the problem that faces solid state batteries. So this is a little cartoon, shows you a solid state battery. You will have typically a lithium metal anode here. You'll have this ceramic electrolyte, and then you'll have a mixture of the ceramic electrolyte and the positive electrode material here. And the problem at the negative electrode is when you try to charge a battery like this, you plate lithium. Lithium miraculously can find its way through ceramics that are 99% dense. It's like toothpaste passing through concrete. So how on earth does that happen? We think we now know. There are challenges in the cathode because the cathode particles expand and contract as you charge and discharge, but the other thing, the solid electrolyte doesn't, and so you get detachment and all sorts of things there. So those are some of the scientific challenges we're looking at. It's important because this is the market growth potential here. You can see this rising to 2,000 gigawatt hours worldwide by 2040. And it's really needed by the automotive companies because they won't be able to deliver the EVs to get 100% decarbonization of electric vehicles by 2035 without step change in battery technology. We've signed up to targets, which is great. I'm not sure we've actually understood the technological challenges that will have to be met to deliver on those targets. That's one example of 2035. We're also talking about decarbonizing our electricity grid by 2035. Well, there's a problem. And Griswold and Smith, who of course was a pioneer of this network, who's sitting in the middle there, can tell you a lot more about the problem. Okay, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to tease too much more. I've given you a little bit of an overview of some of the scientific challenges. We have partners such as Jonathan Matty and British Volt, this new company that's going to manufacture lithium-ion batteries in the Northeast. Let me talk about multi-scale modeling very briefly. Multi-scale modeling, name, I suppose, again, speaks for itself. It's modeling batteries right from the atomic scale, right up to not just the battery cell, but the pack, the whole system. It's developing software and know-how that will allow us to make batteries smarter. In other words, shorten the lines between a concept and realizing a prototype, which is very important. This startup company, About Energy, has been launched, which is a consultancy company that will allow, will go in and help to parameterize batteries that people are trying to work on and manufacture and scale, and help accelerate the pace of change there. They're also looking at the thermal management. This is one of the big challenges in batteries. As you charge them faster, you have more heat dissipation, and all sorts of bad things can happen. So controlling heat management in these systems is hugely important. And a lot of this is open source. So we're really trying to make tools available to the wider community. We're not just locking this up with one or two companies. Briefly, Nextrode is looking at how you make smarter batteries. So at the moment, the electrodes in lithium-ion batteries are made using cassette tape technology from the 1970s. And it hasn't really changed very much. You take particles, you take a slurry, you spread it onto a metal backing. There's your electrode. So this project is trying to be a lot smarter. Even just grading the size of the particles can mean that you can get the same energy storage, but charge and discharge the battery far faster. So you can get those fast charging rates that people want, 10 minutes charging an EV without compromising the energy density. There's a sort of law of batteries that you can have more energy storage or more rate, but you can't have both. Well, this is a way of getting a bit of both into the system. And they're looking at spray deposition technologies that give you more effective electrode fabrication as well. So smarter particles, smarter slurry control, that's collaboration with Sheffield and Birmingham. New manufacturing methods are being focused at Begbrook here in Oxford. And there's a lot of work on simulation using AI, machine learning, not only to design the battery systems, but actually to use them on real time on the manufacturing process, to control the manufacturing process more effectively. And I think my time is up, probably slightly more than up, but I'm not too far over time, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. If anybody has a question for Peter, yeah. No, Chris, you're banned. Anybody else? You two can talk later on, and we got 20 seconds. We'll allow that later on. Okay. I'm going to now welcome Radhika to talk to the next one. Sorry, we're about 5 minutes over time, so that's why I just wanted to keep it short. But I know when you two start talking, half an hour later.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'll try and be brief. So this is the Future of Cooling program, which is also housed in the Oxford Martin School, and is in the spirit of everything in the Oxford Martin School, extremely interdisciplinary. We draw from 3 different divisions, from engineering, from the School of Geography and Environment, and from the medical sciences. And because this is probably the youngest of all the programs that is being presented here, it learns from integrate and from post-carbon transitions. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on content, but I'm happy to talk about the procedural aspects of how this program works later. Let me just sort of, talk about why this issue of cooling has crept in on us in the last few years. If you look here, you see the forecast is by the end of the century, the world energy demand from cooling is going to be much more than heating. And often that is ignored. It's something we don't really fully recognize. But there is this sort of stunning IEA statistic about how an equivalent of 10 new air conditioners will be sold every second for the next 30 years. And that's the increase in global energy demand that we're going to see. And by 2050, it's equivalent or larger than the additional electricity capacity for very large economies like the US, EU, and China. And the number of people that face cooling risks is already over 1 billion people. But again, what's really sort of disturbing about this statistic is that in spite of that rise in air conditioners, the cooling gap, so the number of people who actually will not have access to sufficient cooling technologies, is between 2 to 5 billion people in 2050. So that also brings equity to be at the heart of this issue of the future of cooling. And our research program is shaped around the question of how do we understand and shape this unprecedented future trajectory of global cooling demand. Now, this drawing from what Malcolm showed on the integrate slide, we've learned and thought about cooling, and we conceptualize it as a socio-technical system. So our starting point is that cooling is a system that has multiple dimensions. It interacts with social and technological components. And we can think of cooling in a way where you break it down into different stages. So you have sort of macro drivers on the system, which many of us understand: urbanization, income rise, changing technologies, environmental change, and geopolitics. But cooling itself can be thought about in terms of the resources that go into creating these different technologies. And I'm talking here of both active and passive technologies, production and assemblages, which is how you bring these things together. What are the processes by which technologies are made? The activities around the use of those technologies, and then the end of life, which is actually really important in sort of the cooling world, not least because of the HFCs that comprise the cooling, cooling technologies, especially air conditioners. Now, the levers on the system are also different and multidimensional. Social interactions is really key. Do we open a window? Do we not open a window? What temperature do we put our thermostat at? Technological innovation, which continues to be really interesting. But as I'll show, we are kind of stuck in the way that we think about cooling technologies. Business models, particularly cooling as a service that is growing in traction, governance, which continues to be complicated across countries, and then infrastructure design, which is also an interesting lever because how we design our infrastructure shapes the solution space. And actually thinking of that as a separate lever has been an important piece of this work. And then each of these intersections we think about as, potentially a sensitive intervention point, so at least finding sensitive intervention points within each of those intersections. So this was, we published this in Nature, and it made it to the cover, which we were pleased about, but also sort of brought out this idea how cooling has really been a blind spot in sustainability debates. And that while we think about cooling as something that's linked potentially to thermal comfort, energy, and climate change, we show in this paper how it systematically influences each of the 17 different sustainable development goals. So whether that is education, whether that's inequality, whether that is food through cold chains, whether that's health through vaccines, it actually, it doesn't actually feature in any of the text of the SDGs, but it is central to each of them. So let me just tell you a little bit about our different research streams. I'm only focusing on the energy ones here, but I should say that we have a whole research stream on medicine and also on the circular economy. But in the interest of time, let me focus on technology to begin with. What we find is that we're actually locked into vapor compression air conditioning, and that has been the dominant form in which cooling technologies have been pursued for many decades now, but the technology readiness levels of other options is just not high enough. And given the low cost, the high efficiency, and the multiple applications of air conditioning, it continues to be the immediate form in which we think about cooling and in the way cooling is being pursued. Even the sort of global cooling prize, which was a way to think about what the latest innovations in cooling technologies could be, the winners continue to use vapor compression. And the changes being made now are to think about not just the influence of temperature, but also of humidity on these technologies. But we are locked in both institutionally, behaviorally, and technologically to thinking about vapor compression as a solution, which is a real problem. Not least because using vapor compression actually locks us into this feedback loop where you emit more emissions, there's further global warming, and then you require more air conditioning to deal with that. Now, another stream is therefore to think of alternatives to that, which is to consider the potential of passive cooling, right? Now, passive cooling has been, and that's the use of non-energy intensive mechanical cooling forms, but it's been dominant across cultures, across geographies for a long time, using heat gain prevention, heat gain modulation, and heat dissipation. But what we find is that it isn't dominant in the way that future cooling technologies are being considered. You do see an increase in the, and these are just number of publications from sort of the last 20 years or so. And the countries that dominate this are the US, China, the UK, Italy, and India. But the dominant technology continues to be ventilation. So we did a sort of quick keyword search in the literature, and you see that the things that are being promoted are green roofs, natural ventilation, energy efficiency to some extent, considering the impacts on urban heat islands. Radiative cooling does emerge as a sort of potential technology that could be on the map, but it has real questions around use of space and also its scalability. Now, the third part, or the third work stream, is around actually treating humans as active agents in cooling solution pathways, right? When a lot of our modeling studies are sort of, they take very unified and universal assumptions around how human beings interact with the environment, the temperatures that human beings feel comfortable in. And we've done a lot of work in actually understanding that cooling needs are not just informed by temperature, but they are dramatically influenced by architecture, by design, by food, by drinks, by local culture. And we're doing empirical work in Brazil and in India, but also sort of more globally to understand what the social construction of comfort means, right? And how the need for cooling is actually charged by ideas and perceptions around modernity and progress. And the growth of air conditioning is a real example of that, right? Because in the 60s in the United States, it became the dominant form by which cooling was supplied, which meant that you could have standardized buildings that were, in some sense, agnostic to the outside temperature, because you could put in an air conditioner and then create the same environment indoors, and that became the dominant form. And in that, we're losing a lot of sort of behavioral and cultural approaches to cooling, particularly through vernacular architecture, and using the built environment as a solution form. So this piece of work looks at the role of clothing, diet, lifestyles, and vernacular architecture in influencing thermal comfort. And then finally, let me show you some of the new work that we're doing, which is and this is in collaboration with David's group. This is all preliminary, so sort of do keep that in mind. But what these two graphs tell us is the change in cooling degree days for a 1.5 degree world and a 2 degree world. And what's really sort of staggering here is the shift just in that half a degree, right? So you see that in a 1.5 degree world, the change for the number of cooling degree days, which is sort of the reds, are much lower. They're actually quite high. Then in a 2 degree world where you see a large increase in cooling degree days. And again, this increase in cooling degree days is actually not just in the tropics, but regions like the United States, like parts of Europe, which are going to see exponential increases in the kind of heat that is going to be upon us. We know that the UK had its first extreme heat warning put out by the Met Office last year. And so what we're doing with this is, once we have the modeling results sorted out, is actually to identify the cities and the regions that are going to have the most impact, and then work on shaping cooling solutions and heat action plans for those different regions. So I will stick to time, stop there. I do want to acknowledge the whole team that is absolutely fabulous that works on this. And also that, there is a whole line of work around the impact of extreme heat on health, particularly looking at 40 million patient lives in the UK, and the relationship between heat, morbidity, and mortality. And then also what the circular economy of cooling looks like. But for afterwards, perhaps. Thanks.
Thank you, Radhika. Anybody have a question for Pradika? And Chris, you're allowed to ask this one because I know it'll go on. Anybody have a quick question? Yes, Gavin.
Thanks, Pradika, for a great talk. My question is about engagement with different stakeholders, and particularly the building industry and practice of architecture. Do you have any intention or any information about how you might take the research to them?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's an incredibly essential group of actors. Unfortunately, our program overlapped with COVID in a wonderful way, so we had to change a lot of our plans around engagement. And perhaps now we can begin to think of that and ways of engaging with these different actors. But it was part of our plan starting out, but we have not been able to implement yet. But that's not to say that they're key to how this work goes forward.
Great, thanks a lot, Radhika. Last but not least is Nick talking about his wonderful program CREDS.
Okay, just waiting for the slides. Do I have to click?
They should come up. Yeah, there you go.
Great, so I will try to be quick because I am aware that I stand between you and a coffee break before the next session. Also, many of you know quite a lot about CREDS. This is really just an update. And for those of you who don't and feel that I'm rushing through stuff, I will be around all day, so please feel free to talk to me about it at any point. So what are we? We are a centre funded by UK Research and Innovation. We began in 2018, so we're now 4 years into our 5 years of work. We're highly distributed. We've got more than 20 universities involved now. The core team is based with me here in Oxford, and we act as the hub for energy demand research in UK universities. So we are, in many ways, there are great similarities with the way Peter described the role that Faraday's got in the battery community. We're more than just a research program. UKR has decided that it does want another 5 years of research in this area, and there's a call out now for somebody to lead that, which will not be me. The aims are they're sort of largely what you'd expect: do internationally leading research, have an impact. Anybody who's written a proposal to UKR knows that you have to put those in. The slightly surprising and different one is to champion the importance of energy demand. We feel sometimes like an oppressed minority within the energy research community and stakeholder community, and so we have a role there in sticking up for the importance of thinking about energy demand. We have an extensive research program, as you would expect. It includes work in buildings, transport and materials and products, because those are the areas that energy is principally used in the economy. But we've also got 3 cross-cutting themes on flexibility, on digital society and the changes that we're seeing through digitalisation, and on policy and governance, the last of those led by Tina Fawcett in the ECI. And then 3 specific challenges, big ones, on the decarbonisation of heat, on fuel and transport poverty, which we thought was a big problem when we started and has suddenly got a great deal bigger, and on decarbonisation of steel. I'm not going to say a lot about any of those in any detail for the reasons set out here. This is actually stolen from our research fish submission of last week. Anybody who doesn't know what research fish is, you're very lucky. What it shows is that we've got 350 publications, so I'm not going to going into those is not possible. But also 692 engagements, some of those from over a vast range, from me talking here through to work with citizens groups, and 180 bits of interaction with policymakers. Of course, the numbers don't really matter. It's the quality and what we've got out of those that matters. And that is, as you will all realise, harder to judge. These are what I think our key achievements have been to date. Whether we've succeeded in changing the terms of the debate, I don't know, but we are aiming to argue that energy use is central to the energy transition. It's not just about energy efficiency. As Radhika indicated, it's about other ways in which demand can be changed. It's about flexing the use of energy in time. And of course, it's about switching fuels as well, which is an end-use energy activity. We're doing a lot to develop people. I'm not saying we've solved how to address equality, diversity and inclusion in university research. We clearly haven't, but we are making progress and we're building capacity in the energy demand research community, particularly to develop a group of people who are capable and interested in working across social and technology issues, because for all the reasons that Mike set out earlier, actually a lot of the challenges do cross-cut technology and society, and thinking about one or the other independently is not a sensible thing to do. We're contributing to practical solutions. We do respond to stakeholder needs. So I was in a meeting, for example, with Bays on Monday that they asked for because they thought we were the right people to ask about how can you save energy in a hurry. It's maybe a bit of a pity that they waited until we need to do it, but better late than never. We're developing methods, models, tools. We've got a model, almost unbelievably to me, of the building stock at a building by building scale in most of the UK, which Bays are very interested in. We've got a local carbon a local carbon calculator that is designed to be useful to local authorities. And we actually, through colleagues at Leeds, provide the input to DEFRA that allows calculations of consumption-based emissions for the UK. We're trying to professionalise knowledge exchange across this community to move away from the model beloved of university researchers, which is, I have finished my my project, I have published a report on it, and I hope somebody will read that paper. That doesn't really work, and we're trying to move forward in a more professional approach to that. I'm only going to talk about one case study, which is our work on low energy demand scenarios. I'm going to talk about it because it is being influential. We're working with the Government Office of Science on it now. We're presenting it to some parliamentary groups next week. Last week, it was presented to a meeting of all the government chief scientists. They have breakfast meetings, apparently. I didn't know that. So it was quite an interesting thing to be at. And the key messages are that reductions are possible in every energy using sector of the economy, quite significant ones, and that those reductions need a combination of changes to technical efficiency and social change. And interestingly, they play out differently across different sectors. The main ways that we can reduce energy use in industry, for example, are through thinking about how we use the materials and products that industry produces, whereas the main ways that we can improve efficiency in buildings are, to insulate them and put in efficient heating systems. So there's some, but the key message is that the combination of the two can halve our energy use in buildings by 2050. Yes, halve. We can do on the demand side more than half of what is needed. That's what that shows. 4 scenarios, the most radical, reducing energy demand by 50%. So we think that demand is going to be central to delivering net zero commitments. We're arguing that increasingly forcefully. It's not a hair shirt agenda. Any of you who read the Prime Minister's introduction to the 10-point plan will understand the reference, because sadly he still does see reducing demand as a hair shirt agenda. It significantly reduces the need for electricity growth and therefore, in our view, makes the transition a much more practical and easier proposition. You may say demand reduction is hard to do, but more than doubling the size of the electricity sector seems even harder to do to me. We conclude that energy demand needs an explicit plan. 4 weeks ago, I wasn't very hopeful that we would get any sort of explicit plan for demand reduction. The agenda has changed. I've spoken to more journalists in the last 4 weeks than the preceding 4 years because energy security is a bigger driver of this agenda than climate. Sadly, perhaps, but that seems to be the situation. So I'm not going to say a lot about it. It is sort of work in progress for us to develop an agenda for policymakers, but it is quite a long agenda, which is why the writing is quite small. I'm not going to go through it in detail. The key message is that we've always said we need a long-term 2050 plan for demand reduction. We sort of know what that looks like through the work that I've described, but actually we also need a short-term plan, because without that, people are going to die of cold in this country next winter. It's as simple as that. So there's a list of things there which we are talking to policymakers about. We are developing it as we go. There are some really important actors, local authorities and charities who are working on fuel poverty on the ground. They're the people who can spend money sensibly, quickly, not big new national programs. Buses need financial support. We do need a public information and advice program. I think we know that from the pandemic, that those sort of things can work if they're put out in a sensible way and by trusted authorities. Actually, we're also going to need direct financial support for some of the poorest households as well, I think. So I'll leave you with that. I'm really happy to talk to people about that because I say it's work in progress. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Anybody got a question for Nick? Yes.
I work with the university in decarbonising heating buildings. I'm particularly interested in insulating and airtightness to buildings, and I've noticed in today's talks, I think your talk was the first talk that mentioned insulation, and it seems like the country's completely gone away from it. Is fearful of insulation, maybe Grenfell or whatever. But how can we change that discussion? Because we've got to do something with our existing buildings. I know architects will do lots with our new buildings, but everyone's stepping back from dealing with existing buildings.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, Mark. That's fine. But I am actually surprised that it is coming back up the agenda. I never thought I would live to see the day when people occupied roads in order to argue for insulation. Something has changed that has happened.
You do that.
You do, but people are even more remarkable. People are prepared to get locked up to campaign for insulation. Yeah, this is amazing for those of us who've worked in this area for 30 years. I'm not saying I would do it, but it needs so that's an intervention at one end. At the other end, there's people like you working on a building by building practical approach, and that is sort of most of what is going to be needed. And I have many colleagues in the room. I'm looking particularly at the back at Marina and Gavin, who know a lot more about this area than we do. I think ventilation is an issue post-COVID. And one that people are going to have to think about more seriously. The idea of an airtight building being the ideal, maybe not a bit more difficult than it used to be. But yeah, talk to colleagues in the energy group or me.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nick. Right, so we're now going to change gear a little bit, and this is where we split into multiple people.
So I was going to say, neat segue into the energy use in buildings, which will, from your program, be in seminar rooms 1 and 2. You can see the other streams, one of which is going to be chaired in this room by Malcolm. There's a gap in the program. That's the trouble with having a physical copy, it doesn't keep up to date. So Alison Smith will be speaking about bioenergy this afternoon in the renewable generation session. So Malcolm, you're allowing everyone a comfort break, coffee, and